Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and I just want to say, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can check us out on any of the fine podcast platforms out there. Wherever you get your fine podcast content, be sure to add the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour to it. And if you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you can see what's going on inside the studio by checking out our YouTube channel. We also have a couple of other podcasts out there, the Business of America and the China Desk. So please check those out, but subscribe, mash down on the like button, leave a comment, and most importantly, let your friends and family members and your family members' friends know all about how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Excited to bring on our guest today. His name is James Broughel, Dr. James Broughel. He's a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's an accomplished economist whose expertise lies in regulatory institutions and the impact of regulations on economic growth, something obviously very near and dear to my heart. He is the author of the book, Regulation and Economic Growth, Applying Economic Theory to Public Policy, and is a regular columnist at Forbes, where he writes on topics such as energy and hidden energy taxes, the economic costs of regulation, as well as a little work on cryptocurrency as well. He holds a PhD in economics from George Mason University, a BA and MA in economics from Hunter College at the City University of New York. James, my father has his undergraduate degree from Hunter as well. We call that UCLA. I don't know if you've heard that term.
I haven't heard that term.
The university on the corner of Lexington Avenue.
Oh, okay.
We have great deal of affection for Hunter College. He's currently a Hoover Institution Visiting Fellow under the state and local government initiatives new Small Business Regulation Research Program. Want to talk to him about that. All of these issues near and dear to my heart. He also lives on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which, as you all know, is also near and dear to my heart. James, thanks for coming on. I also want to get your thoughts. Obviously, we've been talking to everybody about the passing of the great Fred Smith. I don't want to start there. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's start here with this report that you guys have just put out on permitting. We had a conversation with Thomas Hochman about this, just released a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, there is this interplay between federal and state regulation, and a lot of folks forget the state component and the state red tape component in terms of the state component of red tape in terms of the permitting process. Talk about this new report, what you found and what you're recommending.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me.
Always.
So I'm, as you mentioned, I'm a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution this year. And so as part of this project that I'm doing for them and also with CEI, I'm putting out a series of reports on state permitting reform efforts. So there's been a lot of attention in the last year or so to federal permitting reform and the possibility there could be some kind of big deal, grand bargain, so to speak, to reform the federal permitting process. Still remains to be seen whether that will happen. But I wanted to kind of look at the states and see if there were any best practices, reforms that we could learn from as far as what the states are doing to fix their permitting processes. So my project is definitely focused mostly on the state level and not as much on the interplay between like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act and how they're implemented at the state level. I know Thomas Hochman, who you said you've had on your show recently. I know he's been doing some great work on that. So that's kind of one way in which the research I've been doing is somewhat different from his. But
good, great.
So I put out, I have, 8 or 9 of these reports out so far on different state efforts. The most recent one is on North Carolina, and it's somewhat timely given obviously the disaster that just happened there with Hurricane Helene. And so I would say, North Carolina's done some things to fix its permitting process, but it's not necessarily a leader on permitting reform. They have made some improvements to their State Environmental Policy Act. I guess it was around 2015 they did this. So these are like, so at the federal level, we have NEPA, which is environmental review strategy, which basically says if the government does engages in some major action, like issuing a permit, then they have to assess the environmental implications of that and do analysis.
Whatever that winds up meaning, yes.
Yeah. And so many states kind of, after that law passed in the late 60s, many states copied that and adopted some version of that at the state level. And so North Carolina has a law like that, and it's been gradually adding, I would say, exemptions to it.
Sure.
Increasing the scope of exemptions, saying projects that have they have to meet some certain cost threshold in order to trigger it, or be of a certain size in terms of area.
But hold on for a second. Talk about this, because this is obviously not unique to North Carolina. Talk about why that is, because folks who are not necessarily out of the free market limited government community, they might be like, well, why are we putting in exemptions? Talk about the impact of this. If you want, we don't have to talk about NEPA if you don't want to. Interestingly enough, Jim Connaughton, the former chairman of CEQ, has got a piece out about reforming NEPA right now. But talk about how this has impacted projects and the deployment of projects, and whether or not there's been any real environmental benefit, or what are the environmental benefits that have come because there was always an economic cost of regulation. We're going to get into more of that, but talk about the real world impact here on these projects.
Well, one of the interesting things about NEPA is that it doesn't have any requirements that say you have to do anything about the environment. Now, this isn't always true at the state level.
Right.
These are mitigation requirements that say if you find something, you have to do something about it. NEPA actually doesn't say that. It just says you need to figure out what the environmental impacts are before you make a decision. And you could find that it has terrible environmental impacts and then just decide to move forward anyway.
Sure.
It's really just about considering those impacts. So it's just procedural in that sense. One of the strange things about NEPA is it was kind of the first major piece of environmental legislation that passed in the United States. And in a sense, I think that's unfortunate, because we have the Clean Air Act, we have the Clean Water Act, we have the Endangered Species Act. So we have all these other environmental statutes that kind of address key environmental issues.
Right.
And then we have this NEPA statute, which seems somewhat redundant when considered alongside all those other statutes. So it's not
the creation of those other three statutes possibly should have sunsetted NEPA is part of what you're
exactly
saying. Right.
So we may have never needed NEPA if we had just passed those laws and then been done with it. But the problem essentially is that NEPA is very vague. Sometimes people talk about how it's only 5 pages long. And so it's unclear exactly what it means. And so the courts and regulatory agencies like the Council on Environmental Quality have had to basically interpret what it means.
Yeah.
What does it mean to do an environmental assessment? Does every action that government engages in need some kind of environmental impact statement? And so these long regulations have been written out, some of which are just trying to make it manageable, make the whole system just to say, hey, small projects just need a short environmental assessment. If you find there's no significant impact, you can proceed. But in cases where there is a significant impact, then this analysis has to be done. And essentially, it just becomes this magnet for litigation. It's an opportunity for interest groups, primarily environmental groups, to challenge any kind of development project and say, you didn't consider this impact, you didn't consider that impact. It's unclear what the scope of these environmental assessments needs to be. And so they just get longer and longer and longer over time. They're notoriously, get into the hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages in length. And the lawsuits will continue to say, you didn't consider this, you didn't consider that. And all of a sudden they're considering shadows and things that barely even seem tied to the environment. And so it's really, you need Congress to step in and limit who has the right to challenge under the statute,
right?
And what is the proper scope of the analysis when you can just say this is done and we don't need to consider it further. And that's probably what's needed at the federal level. And then when you look at the states and you see that more than half the states don't even have one of these statutes on the books, and there aren't lakes catching on fire or whatever that scary story is. Then it really makes you wonder whether the statute's needed at all.
So when you're looking at North Carolina, one of the other things I should have mentioned was we also, thinking about the release order of the episodes, I think we will have released Alex Adams' episode from Idaho where he's talking about what they're doing in terms of regulatory reform there. Obviously, there's a difference, somewhat of a difference between regulatory reform and permitting reform. But obviously, we're talking about Idaho as a way of leading the way. But what are some of the other states that you're looking at, and what are some conclusions that you've drawn from the 8 states you've looked at so far?
Sure. So first of all, I love the work Alex has been doing out in Idaho. I've followed it closely. I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal recently where I said that the federal government needs to copy the Idaho sunset.
There you go. And I had a piece up at Real Clear Policy last week on the same thing. So I'm glad. Great minds are thinking alike here, James.
Yeah. I would say there's a few kind of best practices that I've encountered so far. First of all, I would say one area that just seems to be missing is I haven't seen, aside from the fact that a number of states don't seem to have these little NEPA laws, I haven't seen a lot of really significant reforms to those laws yet. And I've maybe looked at 10 states in depth with and a number of others a little more cursory nature. But so that's kind of missing, like no big judicial review reforms or, so I think that's somewhat worrying, but there are a number of best practices in somewhat other areas of environmental permitting. So one I would say is Virginia. Virginia's had an initiative under Governor Northam, who's the current governor.
Youngkin. Northam was the last one.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Youngkin.
All right.
Sorry. Yeah. Under Governor Youngkin it's called the Virginia Permit Transparency Initiative. Good. And this is basically an effort to put all of their permits online into a digital portal where you can track them. And so it on the one hand serves as a customer service improving tool for the public to submit applications and track their applications through the process. It also serves as a management tool on the government side to try to manage all the hundreds of thousands. I think they get 400,000 or something applications for different kinds of permits each year.
Wow.
And just as important, just the process of having to audit or review all the permits, I think is very beneficial because in order to put them in this portal, you need to identify all the permits and then map out the process and assign timelines, expected timelines to the different stages of the permitting process. So it doesn't make sense for every permit. It makes sense for more complicated permits that have multiple stages or multiple reviews by multiple entities.
Right. Hold on for a second. They're building a massive indoor water park right off of I-95 in like Spotsylvania County. I can see why that would require a lot more permitting than, say, somebody who's putting in, I was going to say a pizzeria, but somebody who's putting in a small retail shop somewhere. Or a small retail strip mall somewhere. I think it would be a little bit different in terms of the process.
That's true. But one of the things that's interesting about this portal is if you go on there, you'll see that some of the items in there are these big, whatever developments, power plants or whatever. And others are like someone building a shed in their backyard.
Wow.
So they actually have things that are that granular projects.
And somebody who had a vested interest in making sure the bureaucracy was maintained, they would put out an argument for that granular thing, right? I mean, that's essentially part of what we're talking about here. We're going to get into government efficiency in a second. I'm sorry, James, go right ahead. That app portal it's online. It started as a pilot project. I'm a big fan of pilot projects. It was called the PEEP project. They had this little cartoon marshmallow mascot. Nice.
Permitting evaluation platform or something. But and now it's expanded. They have 6 departments, and they're major departments like transportation, energy, environment, a few others. And they're expanding it every few months. They announce a couple more departments have been added. And I think they plan to potentially even add local level permits and just have this be a statewide document. And this is really, I think it serves as a model for the federal government. I mean, there was the Fiscal Responsibility Act passed in 2023, which had some tweaks to NEPA in it. It was significant because it was really the first changes to NEPA in decades. But
let me ask you this, and this will sort of open up our entree into talking about DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. One of the recommendations that I'm making, it's one that I've had for a very long time, is that there should be a portal where if you are a business owner, small business owner especially, you should be able to go to a portal, enter in a few key pieces of information about your business, kind of business you have, size of your business, location of that business, and it should be able to spit out in plain English, every regulation you need to comply with and how you need to comply in the timelines. And talking about the work that you've done on AI and the work that CEI has done and others have been doing on the promise of AI as an innovation. Talk about what a portal like that would do for small businesses, how AI can be used, what this means for the future down the road.
Right. So, just real quick, the federal government is basically studying this issue.
Yeah.
And so they put out a report that basically said it would be very complicated to try to build something like this for NEPA. But the benefits, if they could do it, and what Virginia has done and is continuing to do, is that it helps identify where the problems are.
Right.
Which isn't always obvious. I mean, it's not even clear. I mean, how many permits does the federal government issue? Does anyone even know that?
No, I don't think they do.
And if you do an audit, you'll get a count. Pennsylvania did an audit like this recently, and they found something like 2,400 different permits that the state issues. And as I said, Virginia, they now know they receive 400,000 applications or something like that a year, and I think there's 100,000 that are currently in the portal. So first, it just gives you a sense of the lay of the land. Then you can get a sense of which permits are taking the longest, which stages in the process are taking the longest, and whose fault is it? Because it's not always the government. Sometimes it's the applicant, but it can be the process is complicated.
I mean, getting into this DOGE issue, right? The work that this entity needs to do, and I think we all agree that this is work that needs to be done. There are folks even on the left who think that this is work that needs to be done. We have a federal government that doesn't know how large the regulatory state is in terms of mandates, right? We don't know that. As you just said, we don't know how many permits are being issued. We don't know how much land, how much real property the federal government owns and where that is. At the very least, DOGE ought to be doing this kind of accounting to get a handle as to the scope of the problem, shouldn't they?
I think so. So, I mean, the Trump administration, the first time around, instituted a regulatory budget, and it was the first time this had been done at the federal level. But it wasn't comprehensive. It only applied to new regulations, and specifically only new regulations that are reviewed by the Office of Management and Budget, which was overseeing and that's like fewer than 10% of regulations. So all the independent agencies like SEC, FERC, those kinds of agencies, they were exempt from it. And all the regulations that were on the books that add costs, in the trillions of dollars annually, those were exempt. They can just continue adding costs. It was just these new. So I think that something like an audit of all the regulations on the books, tallying up every requirement that's in place. And in fact, Virginia did something like this under Governor Northam, actually under Northam. And this project was continued under Youngkin. But they cataloged every requirement they had in place. And it was a few 100,000. And you can figure out what's the statutory authority. Does the agency have discretion to remove this regulation or amend it without any, laws being passed by Congress? So I think an audit like this would be very useful. And you can use AI for that. You can use Mercatus Center, where I used to work, has a tool called RegData that has estimates of a number of restrictions in the code. But I think, I'm not sure. I think AI can be helpful as a first pass, but probably it's going to take real people going through the code and figuring out, like, should we keep this? Should we keep that? Can we eliminate this? Can we cut this cost, cut this fee? And that's going to take a lot of manpower. And this is one of the reasons I'm a little concerned with the way that, Elon
Talk
Musk.
about it. Talk about your concerns with this.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I think what DOGE has going for it is it's got these very high profile, charismatic leaders in the form of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy.
Right.
And I think they're great at bringing attention to these issues that people like myself, a lot of people in think tank community have been talking about for a long time, but we don't have the platform they have. And so it's great to see them drawing attention to the administrative state, how much regulation there is, and so forth. But I think that there as this advisory body, whatever, it's
not a
part of the
department. Yes, that
government.
we know. Doesn't have
Doesn't have any
the stamp.
authority.
Yes.
They the power is probably going to rest in the fact that Elon Musk maybe has the president's ear and can call him up and say, you should do this. But we already have all the studies, the white papers, the think tank community has been putting this out. I just saw something from Cato Institute today that they have a big list of recommendations for Doge. Government Accountability Office has tons of recommendations over the years. So honestly, that work has mostly been done.
Right.
So, and the question is, what can they add to that?
Right.
They've been going out there, Musk and Ramaswamy, they're talking about cutting the government workforce. And while I think that could make sense once we've cut regulations, it's not really the way you start any kind of regulatory reform.
It's interesting because it gets back to something that Fred Smith used to say, which is, I'm going to paraphrase it. It'll be a little bit more politically sensitive than Fred would have been. It's all well and good to make sure the trains are running on time, but let's not make sure that they're the trains that are doing bad things that bad regimes can do with trains. I'll say it that way. I'm sorry if I've got if you can hear, I may not be able to hear my dogs barking in the background, but efficiency for efficiency's sake is not necessarily what we're after. We're after a regulatory state that better serves the people, doesn't have the impact. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. And what worries me is that if you're going to really do a serious audit like Idaho did, and I actually went out to Idaho in 2019, they sunset their entire administrative code. Right. And it would happen under very strange circumstances. There's a review requirement where the legislature reauthorizes a code every year. There was some infighting between the different chambers that year. They left town, didn't reauthorize the code. And so what happened was basically the executive branch had about 4 months to figure out what to do before the entire regulatory code expired. And I went out there during that period and I met with a bunch of the civil servants who were working on these issues. And what kept hearing from people was, at first we thought this was crazy. What are they doing? They're out of their minds. But then they realized, hey, this is an opportunity to make a lot of improvements. And it gave them cover in some cases where they knew things didn't work, but maybe it's hard to admit that this program is failing because you're just going to get attacked and blamed for that. And they got to make a lot of changes. And by the end of the process, they saw value in doing that review. Right. And it wouldn't have worked without the civil servants. And Elon Musk isn't going to be going through these regulations.
Of course.
Doge doesn't have any staff as far as I'm aware
of.
Maybe
the thing. Have some. It's gonna be these agencies themselves. I think you're absolutely right. It's why I've always been skeptical of folks who sort of express this in terms of a number of employees. Again, it's one way of looking at it, but it's not the only way. Isn't it interesting? This will sort of be a good entree to talking about your book, Regulation and Economic Growth, Applying Economic Theory to Public Policy. I mean, 2016 was the first time I ever heard a presidential candidate utter the phrase regulatory budgeting at a presidential debate, right? And we'd spent a lot of time working down that road. Happened to be Marco Rubio in one of the debates. And here we are now. I think we are finally at a point where we're having even more serious discussions about the impact of regulation on the economy. Talk about your book and talk about how you frame and view the issue.
Sure. I mean, I think in some ways it's unfortunate the way that the regulatory budget issue has turned out, because if you go back to the 70s, Jimmy Carter was a proponent of the regulatory budget. I think it was Lloyd Benson. Is that his name? The Democratic senator
from Texas. Absolutely. Lloyd Benson.
Yeah. Who introduced one of the first bills related to regulatory budget.
Said to Dan Quayle, "You're no Jack Kennedy," but yes, go ahead.
So it was, this was kind of what was on people's radar as far as what regulatory reform meant. And what ended up happening was we ended up getting a lot of cost benefit analysis requirements. Right. So Reagan came in, he had this big executive order, and the regulatory budget kind of fell by the wayside. And in large part, I kind of blame the economics profession for this, is that they got this kind of idea in their heads that this was the correct way to think about the regulatory state and efficient regulation. and that just cutting costs with a regulatory budget is, not theoretically.
Hold on. I'm going to interrupt you, James, because I literally had this conversation with somebody at the dog park yesterday and was talking about my views on the limits to cost benefit analysis. They're very one dimensional. They only tell you if something is the fiscally responsible way to do something. They don't tell you if it's the smart way to do something, if it's actually addressing the problem that you're trying to solve. I mean, am I reading that correctly?
I mean, there's, the analysis that agencies have been doing has been completely inadequate for decades, right. And really through Democratic and Republican administrations. There's very clear guidelines on what it should be done. It should you should start with outlining the problem you're trying to solve. What's the market failure? What evidence is there this problem exists? And
right.
Or you can even solve it in an effective way. So before you even go about tallying up costs and benefits, you should be asking these questions. And what are my options? What are the different alternatives? These are where these analyses are really just fail again and again and again. And it's the same problems year after year. Every time I open up one of these documents, it's the same problems.
But it gets worse when you change how you measure the benefits, right? This is the problem that we saw with Circular A4 and what the Biden administration did, and I know CEI, and I don't know how much involved in that comment writing process you are. I wrote our comments for it. They completely when you start inventing benefits and the measurement of benefits, it completely skews the analysis. I mean, that's something we need to, one of the recommendations we've made is to sort of revert. Obviously, it starts with reverting to the prior use, the prior language in A4, which has got folks the guidance that the White House levies on how to do cost-benefit analyses. But obviously, we should, we should go further in terms of that, shouldn't we?
Yeah, I mean, so essentially, it's just become a tool for, the benefits analyses just in general are not credible. And I have conceptual problems with the methods that they use. I think they're not correct. I think the way that they measure benefits is not correct. There's techniques like the value of a statistical life that I think are inappropriate actually for use in a social estimate of benefits and costs. But I mean, there's technical reasons for why I think that. But in practice, what we get is they tack on benefit after benefit after benefit and come up with some sort of way of turning that into a dollar number. And then they overlook the opportunity costs.
Right.
They overlook what's displaced as a result, or they don't deal with that issue correctly. And
we do a terrible job at measuring, if we do it at all. I mean, measuring opportunity cost. I've said that I think there's a $19 multiplier in every dollar in direct regulatory cost and lost opportunity cost. But, and you may have your own number, but that's at least the one that I use. But this is a huge issue. Actually, explain why opportunity cost is a huge issue when we're talking about these things.
Well, I mean, when the government forces a business, let's say, to comply with a regulation, you have to spend $1 million installing the piece of equipment in the factory, or, adding the human resources and accountants and attorneys to this payroll in order to comply with all the rules. That's money and people, human capital, resources that aren't going to some other purpose to produce stuff and generate output. And there would be some multiplier associated with that of good stuff compounding at some rate into the future that you give up. And cost benefit analysis doesn't address this issue correctly. And it's not just, and the Biden administration really made this much worse.
Yes.
With its update to Circular A4, which are the regulatory analysis guidelines, but the methods were not good before that.
Right.
So even the Bush administration, I think, did fail to deal with this issue properly when it wrote the original 2003 guidelines.
The example I like to use is, let's say there are clean air regulations that are put out there, and they say that a pizzeria has to get rid of their coal-fired pizza ovens, and they have to, or even gas-fired pizza ovens. They have to, update it and put in an electric pizza oven. God forbid! I cringe at the thought of this. But the bottom line is, at least right now, the measurement of the cost is, let's say it's $30,000 to replace that oven. Now that's a direct cost, and that's a high cost, but that's also money that they can't use to get better software or that they can't use for marketing, or they can't use to hire somebody to make more pizzas for them. So that's the opportunity cost. In a nutshell, is the other things, the more productive ways that resource can be used in all of this. I mean, so let's shift gears a little bit, because you've been at Mercatus and they do great work, and CEI, and you're visiting fellow at Hoover. Because I've asked other folks, just talked to another CEI alumnus, Taylor Barkley. Fred Smith just passed. I've written about that. I mean, actually, I don't even know. Were you at CEI with Fred? I mean, I know Fred sort of cast a long shadow, but go ahead.
So no, I mean, I haven't. I had never actually met him, but obviously he has had a huge influence on everyone at CEI.
Yes,
and indirectly in that sense.
There is a cult of Fred, but it's actually, let me sort of shift gears, because you mentioned all the good work that the think tank world is doing. We've talked about the work that Alex is doing out in Idaho. There is what is wonderful about the work that you're doing in terms of looking at the states and how they approach these permitting issues, is it underscores the importance of federalism as laboratories of democracy. And I know that's an overused phrase, but it allows us to sort of look at what works and what doesn't work, and what works really well, and to try to find ways to apply that to solving the national problems. I admit, I focus more on the national things, just because for me, it's bandwidth. It's funny, because I was at one point was going to come on board at Mercatus to do the Reg Studies program. That didn't happen, and then they wanted me to come on board to do state work, and I didn't, and I regret that. But I didn't feel that it was my strong suit. But talk about this issue of competitive federalism and the solutions that folks are coming up with, and why that's a good thing.
Well, I think in the regulatory reform space, the federal government is just kind of stalled. And I like what the Trump administration did with the regulatory budget. I think that was a step in the right direction. But I think we've seen more action at the state level in terms of actually really trying to address this issue of just the growth of regulation. And even Trump's 1 in 2 out. I mean, that came from, Canada had 1 in 1 out, I think, before that. And UK had a version of this. So, that wasn't necessarily original with the Trump administration. But
sure,
in the last several years, we've seen states like Virginia, Ohio, Idaho really take pretty bold action to try to make major reductions in their regulatory codes. And not, Oklahoma is another state where they maybe haven't succeeded yet, but 25% reduction target that they had in an executive order that said, wow, that's what we're aiming for. And Virginia currently has a 25% reduction. I think they're on track to actually hit that. Idaho reduced their administrative code by, depending on the measure, 30, 40%, something like that. So at the federal level, we have 188,000 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. Just goes up year after year. And I think in the first Trump term, it was flat, basically.
Yes.
So they kind of stopped regulations, but didn't reduce them. And so the states seem to be having some success actually reducing it. And how do they do it? They do it through things like audits, basically measuring how much regulation they have, capping the overall level, setting reduction goals, implementing sunset reviews, and imposing and with a sunset process, you need it to be like Idaho's. You need it to be, they had a zero-based regulation executive order, is what they're calling it. But basically, it's easy to eliminate the rules. It's really hard to put them back in place. You need to justify them through economic analysis, through evidence, to show this isn't actually needed. This is actually working. It's solving a problem. Otherwise, it sunsets automatically. Because sunset reviews, they can become kind of a rubber stamp exercise. So it has to be, there has to be a process where you're removing the regulation explicitly, and then you're replacing it and justifying it at the same time. So the lesson, the federalism lesson is the states really are the laboratories of democracy. In this area, I think they're having more success than the federal government.
That's good. And it's good to know. So let's talk a little bit about you before we let you go. So
Sure.
Where'd you grow up? How did you make the transition from Hunter College? As I said, we love Hunter College in my family, down to George Mason. How did you start doing this work? Talk about that.
Yeah. So I have somewhat of an unusual story. So, I mean, I grew up in Massachusetts, Newton, Massachusetts, outside Boston. I would say I was kind of a, troubled teenager, maybe you would say. And so, I went to the kind of school where everybody was like hyper competitive. They wanted to get, that was my high school. They wanted to get into, the elite schools and stuff. And I was really just completely uninterested in any of that as a teenager.
Got it.
And, so I graduated high school and I moved to New York, and I played in rock bands for a number of years. And I started off kind of going to coffee shops as singing my own songs, but then I sort of realized I'm probably going to have more success. I just saw sort of some of the, personality traits that seem to go along with being successful in the music business. I wasn't sure I was a front man. So I started playing bass, and I played in a band. It was called Levy. We put out a couple albums on a indie label in the UK. It was called One Little Indian.
Wow.
And we got to tour over there a couple times. And I wouldn't say we were successful. We had at one point we were on the college radio charts. And
Wait, what was the name of the band? And when was this?
This was, I think our first album came out in 2005 or 6.
Okay, this is after my time then in college radio. Okay.
It was, so it was Levy is the name of the band, which is the singer's last name, Levy.
What we'll come back to the journey in a second, because I'm a huge music buff, and this actually is a perfect entree. Most of my guests know that I wanted to do a podcast at one point called Outside Interests, which is talking to people in politics and public policy about their outside interests that have nothing to do with politics or public policy. So, for instance, Larry Spivak at the Phoenix Center plays harmonica in a blues band in Maryland, and Senate staffer plays guitar. And by the way, I think there are formations of a good band here that are coming together. So, and I love talking music with folks. So, who are some of your influences? I mean, before you were going to do this, and let's not sleep on the fact that you can have bass players who are lead singers. I mean, I'm looking at Geddy Lee and I'm looking at, Sting, but talk about some of your influences that were out there.
Yeah. I mean, well, what got me into music when I was 13 was Nirvana. I mean, and grunge, I was, was big. And, so I was obsessed with Kurt Cobain. I was obsessed, and I became really interested in punk rock and just that whole philosophy of honesty, the truth, technical ability is overrated, and it's more about passion and showing your true whatever emotions or self through the music. And I was drawn to that. I loved this band, The Modern Lovers, when I was a teenager.
Sure, absolutely, Jonathan Richman. Yeah,
I got to meet him at one point when we were. Our singer played a show with him one time in Vermont, actually. So I guess the Ramones, the Clash, the Sex Pistols. I loved music like that.
Sure.
And in New York, I was sort of a part of the Brooklyn indie rock scene. So the Strokes were extremely popular. The Interpol. These were kind of the big yeahs. I played a show with them actually one time. And these were bands that were influential on that scene that I was in. And we never got anywhere close to the level of influence of those bands, but we were around in that scene at that time in the early 2000s in New York, kind of post 9/11. New York was kind of getting a fair amount of attention at that point, and there was something happening.
I mean, it kind of, I would say, almost not a repeat, but a boot back towards, the late 1970s timeframe where New York is trying to figure out what it is. And we all know that when there's that level of chaos, there's a huge renaissance in art. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's a great documentary called NY-77, The Coldest Year in Hell, or The Coolest Year in Hell, which talks about sort of the convergence and talking about punk and talking about disco and talking about hip hop and all of those things sort of coming to fruition at that time in the dystopian hellscape that was New York in 1977. But you get those times, and I can see that in the post 9/11 world as New York is trying to figure out what it is. I grew up just north of the city, and went to high school in the Bronx, so these kinds of cycles are things that I'm very familiar with. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's great. I haven't seen that movie, but I had an aunt who was living in New York she moved there in the early 80s, I think, and lived in the Lower East Side. She was an artist. And so she definitely had was very influenced by that sort of 80s art scene in New York and punk rock sort of vibe. And, by the time I moved to New York, I moved there in May of 2000.
Okay.
It was like Rudy Giuliani had kind of cleaned up the 100%. City and it was safe again. And so it was expensive, but it was very expensive, and the artists were starting to leave. I feel like they've probably mostly left at this point, right. But that hadn't quite fully run its course at the time I was there. So it was a nice little period where we didn't have to deal with all like the, homeless tents in Tompkins Square Park, but it was still, so it was safe, but the artists were still,
safe,
there was still an art.
Yes.
I never had any issues as far as like safety.
No, that's true. I mean, I say that. I think about. I worked. It's so funny. I think I told you before we went on. I just interviewed a partner at a former partner at a law firm on the Upper West Side, who became the head of the CFTC, and they moved into their digs up on the west side of Midtown when it was still very much Hell's Kitchen. And it was just as Giuliani was coming into power and just as Giuliani was cleaning things up. And I would, walk from the office on a nice summer afternoon. I would walk from the office and go down and walk to actually do the walk over to Times Square, or not over to Times Square, over to Grand Central Station. And there was still kind of that little sense of danger in me being a tall, guy and putting on my imposing New York face that every New Yorker has when you've lived there a certain amount of time. I, didn't get around, but I got mugged a few times when I was a kid. It didn't escape that, but I was a kid. I mean, this is the early 80s, so I get that. So you go to Hunter and you gain an interest in economics.
Yeah, I mean, basically my band broke up in 2006 or 7. And I was kind of done with the music scene, but I'd had enough of a hint of it I was just like, the lifestyle just didn't seem like it was going to be very appealing. Probably never have very much money. I probably never, there's just a lot of alcohol and bar scene and all. I worked in bars for a number of years.
Sure.
I was just sick of all that. And I had a girlfriend at the time who she got me a subscription to the Economist magazine for some reason. I have no idea why she did that, but that was the first introduction to any economics I really had. It got me following current events much more. I was just kind of blown away by how counterintuitive some of economics can be. And it was opposite of what I've always been told, but very logical and made sense.
Isn't the free market limited government approach, isn't that the punk scene in terms of the economics world? I mean, I would say, listen, obviously we all know, reason is probably at the leading edge of sort of the pop culture aspect of this. But I would say that, the CEIs of the world and the Mercatises of the world are punk in that regard. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's wishful thinking on my part. But what are your thoughts here?
I mean, definitely the message of freedom resonated with me.
Yeah.
Like, individualism, you should be free to do what you want,
right,
as long as you're not hurting other people. And, I just think of all the characters I met in those, early 2000s and the open mic and rock scene. Like New York is just full of kind of interesting, unusual people that you won't meet anywhere else. And I guess, it just sounded right to me. Like, let people live their lives and let them, and I guess in the bar scene, I was so used to seeing people like everyone was paid in cash and they were just evading taxes and like, I wasn't, of course.
But, no, of course. That's all right. Taxation is theft. We all know that's fine.
But that was kind of the way I worked at one bar. They had like 2 sets of books. One was kind of like the official set, and this
is what got Steve Rubell in trouble at Studio 54.
I won't name any names, but I saw a lot of that stuff, and like as regulated as New York City is in a sense, like it also is kind of like anarchy.
But
like
isn't that the lesson, right? That the more regulations you put on, the more folks are going to find ways to evade and work around them. Mm-hmm. So it's essentially not that, it's essentially a Laffer curve when it comes to regulation. I don't know if anybody's ever done that study, right? In terms of compliance.
It's hard to do,
Yes.
I always see all the, these estimates of like, tax data on low income individuals. And I'm like, I just don't believe any of that,
right?
Because I feel like they're hiding all their income. And I'm not saying all low income people do that, but I feel like it's just not, maybe there's less of that as the digital economy has taken hold. But I was immersed in that world of kind of like somewhat off the books, off the beaten track, not really regulated in that world. And I saw how that world works, and it actually, like, people are able to take care of their own business, and they're even people who aren't that educated and maybe you don't think are like smart and high IQ traditional sense, like they know what's good for them, and they're pretty good at like navigating the system and finding out what's best for themselves.
I think we ought to do a panel at some point, an evening discussion, you, me, Nick Gillespie at Reason, where we essentially answer the question. Maybe it's an article, a listicle, where we compare the major libertarian free market limited government think tanks to, rock bands, who are the Clash, who is Rush, who is this, who is that? Anyway, I'm
Johnny Ramone is the first person that comes to mind. I'm like, that guy, American flags everywhere.
Right.
Like he was definitely like pretty conservative as far as his politics.
Well, there's that, but also what I'm thinking is, sort of flipping it though, if Mercatus is the Clash, CEI would be what? And anyway, in the panoply here, I may reach out to Nick and ask him that question.
That's funny.
Always fun. Well, listen, James, how do folks find out more about the good work that you're doing at CEI?
Sure, CEI.org is the website. Fast Track reports are the names of if you go in the reports section of the website, there's a link to Fast Track reports. That's where all my state permitting work is. I've written other papers on AI, on crypto, electricity use, on nuclear radiation policy.
Wow.
Cover all kinds of different topics. But and then on Twitter, I'm at James Broughel, Broughel. You can find me there. So those are probably the best ways.
Check that out. Check out James Broughel. Well, listen, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our guest has been Dr. James Broughel. He's with both the Competitive Enterprise Institute and the Hoover Institution. Listen, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, check us out on one of the many fine podcast platforms that are out there. If you're listening to us on one of those many fine podcast platforms, go and check out our YouTube channel, subscribe, leave a comment, leave a like, and most importantly, let everybody know how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Have a great rest of the week. Enjoy your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream